Right, so we're back to the BBC, folks, because Richard Sharp, the BBC's Tory donating chairman, has quit. Hooray! The official investigation in relation to Sharp has concluded that he did indeed breach the rules in failing to declare his involvement in getting Boris Johnson an £800,000 loan. Sharp, of course, acted as a go-between between Johnson and a chap called Sam Blyth. Though the funny thing is, Blyth didn't actually lend Johnson the money. A lot of people think Blyth was the lender here. Actually, he only ever acted as a guarantor for this loan. To this day, incredibly, after all the time that has passed and everything that's happened, we still do not know who actually lent Johnson that money. Who did he borrow it off? Makes you wonder who does, though, doesn't it? Does Sharp know that too? He approached Blyth, after all. Why did you approach him? Did you know something about the connections the chap had? Anyway, what we do know is that Sharp attempted to distance himself from this all by arranging for senior civil servant Simon Case to take over the arrangements, because Sharp, you see, was himself running to be that BBC chairman, a position that, as a years-long Tory donor, he ought to have been precluded from, given the obvious bias that's obvious to everybody here. However, he put himself in Johnson's good books here. This is certainly how it came across to the public. Done him a favour, hadn't he? And given Johnson's propensity to reward his mates, as then Prime Minister, appoints the BBC chair, again he made a complete mockery of BBC independence and impartiality by giving Sharp the job, because Johnson doesn't believe the rules of mere mortals apply to him, do they? Of course he was going to appoint Sharp to the job. Well, like all good soap operas, plus a dash of the usual Tory incompetence, this all came out anyway in the end. Sharp's links highlighted a KC-led inquiry commenced, with Adam Heppinstall KC concluding that Sharp broke the code on public appointments by failing to inform the interview panel at his interview for the BBC chairmanship about this matter. He should have disclosed it. It has, in their words, by the scope of the inquiry, amounted to a perception of a conflict of interest. Perception, very much a word, I feel, doing a lot of heavy lifting there. He's a Tory donor. He's a former investment banker. He might have been at ITV previously to that, but he doesn't seem to be any sort of a media mogul in any sense of the word, running our media in the sense of informing us, especially when it comes to news. He didn't seem to have the right impartiality to act in a manner not benefiting the Tories when he chooses to fund them and has done for years. But that said, the report only finds Sharp in the wrong based on this technicality. It cleared him of any allegations of only getting the job because he'd done Johnson a favour, even though that is exactly what it feels like and sounds like to everybody else who's been paying attention to this. But just because that's the findings within the scope of the inquiry, that's just what they were looking at, that was their remit. It doesn't mean the public will see it that way, like I said. That's also not to say Sharp hasn't tried to foil this report somewhat, because actually it should have been out over a week ago, but Sharp had his lawyers holding it up as they disputed the findings of it. He helped Johnson out, but wanted this job at the BBC that really he didn't have the right experience for. He didn't have the impartiality for. So badly did he want it, though, that he appeared to be hell-bent, it seemed, on staying put, regardless of the findings that were going to come out, desperately trying to claim it as an unintentional oversight and delaying the release of the report. But you know, forgetting you arranged a near £1 million loan for the then Prime Minister, who has the final sign-off on whether you get the job you were currently being interviewed for, what kind of bumbling, incompetent idiot forgets that kind of thing, Richard? Are you that inept? Are you that big of a bungler? Something so huge to your potential job prospects just happened to slip your mind? Are you even up to the job, in which case, then? Either you are, or you're a liar. So, which is it? Now, Sharp has, of course, had his apologists. Oh, he's very good at his job, some have said. In what way, though? The BBC is more Tory-orientated than ever. Oh, he's got caught up in the Boris circus. It was a very difficult time, others have chimed in. Yep, he was wearing a red nose and water-squirting flower alongside Bozo in the car, wasn't he? Ultimately, the biggest rub amongst these findings, though, is that most people who had been commenting from within the BBC and without were saying he wasn't going to go anywhere. Well, you called that one wrong, didn't you, guys? Because he just quit. I must admit, it surprised me, though. It did surprise me that he ended up going so quickly come the end. I honestly expected him to really dig his heels in, a seeming determination to stay and ensure the BBC continues to operate in Tory interests as it does. He wanted the job. It can only be seen by the wider public to be doing so to ensure the BBC remains a state broadcaster, broadcasting what needs to be for the benefit of the Tory party and not to inform independently and impartially as it is supposed to. For as long as the BBC is actually directly tied to the control of whatever the government of the day is, whichever party it is, it never can be impartial and unbiased. So it will always fail us all the way things stand now. But by going so willingly in the end, resigning instead of having to be sacked, Richard Sharp's spared the guy whose job it would be to do the sacking, because it would be a guy we all know who doesn't do that, doesn't seem to be able to, doesn't like it, seems allergic to it, who has a track record of wringing his hands and praying, people, please resign first, because it would have been our horribly weak Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, of course. I went over a video the other day of all the time Sunak as PM should have stepped in and suspended or sacked people, from Gavin Williamson to Nadim Zahawi to Dominic Raab, and yet he never acts. He stalls. He allows things to drag out. He allows the damage to be done to his government and his party, and therefore the country as a whole, representative of it as they are, and he is, before the decision eventually gets taken out of his hands and people voluntarily fall on their proverbial swords, as Richard Sharp himself has done this morning. These MPs, of course, were work colleagues, but all involved here are old mates. They're all chummy with each other too, of course, and his supporters. And if you can't separate one from the other, then you've no real business being in charge, because you can't lead, therefore. Richard Sharp is formerly of Goldman Sachs, as is Sunak. In fact, Sharp was formerly Sunak's boss. So we had a feeling there would be additional difficulties and much more hand-wringing on Sunak's part if push came to shove. But now the shoe, especially now the shoe was on the other foot. But do you really think Sunak is the sort to have sacked Sharp over this? Because I really don't. It'd require the appearance of a spine we've not yet seen any sign of from him. And they've always remained mates ever since. Likely the main reason why Sharp has gone, relatively speaking, actually without a fuss. I thought the opposite would happen, but Sharp has fallen on his sword, seemingly to help his mate Sunak out. It's actually for that reason, despite the findings of this perception of a conflict of interest, that I expected Sharp to have perhaps been emboldened to dig his heels in, that Sunak would back him, but instead he spared Sunak instead. Greater good of the Tory party thinking, I suppose, though they're not exactly known for their altruism, are they? I only technically broke the rules, seems to be the sentence, is also an excuse that while we as ordinary sensible thinking types would still expect them to go, high standards expected from somebody holding this position and so on and so forth, Sharp, I thought, would actually use the argument to stay because, well, it could have been worse. Sharp got off any charge of being appointed because he did Johnson a favour. And this is another factor that I thought would have given Sunak a headache, because Johnson had been advised to appoint Sharp off the basis of that interview process that Sharp had gone through, of course, and that had been overseen and conducted by the then Minister for Digital Culture, Media and Sport, who just so happens to be the same guy who's just replaced Dominic Raab as Deputy Prime Minister, the grinning buffoon Oliver Dowden. So a can of worms could well have been opened there for Sunak again. So maybe that formed part of Richard Sharp's thinking in deciding to go too. Labour should have been demanding Sharp to go, of course, as well, but they didn't. And there might be a self-serving reason on their part for that too. Appointees to the role have the job for 4 years, barring any issues like Sharp clearly had. And they won't have wanted Sunak to appoint somebody now that they might not be able to get rid of for years into their potential tenure in government that might begin next year. Though I still think with Starmer still leading them, they're being rather overly optimistic there. Still, a Tory-leaning BBC chairman, we've just got rid of one, no reason to think they won't appoint another. Overseeing the BBC with a Labour government, you can imagine things can and would have been made rather difficult for them in the news department. But this has now come to pass anyway, though. So really it's an open goal in the end that Starmer has yet again missed. But that's, again, is the thing, isn't it? The thing that exposes all the problems with the BBC. Labour shouldn't actually have feared calling this guy out and demanding his resignation, or demanding that Sunak grow a backbone and sack him, because it is supposed to be impartial, yet clearly and obviously it cannot ever be. Well, the government still functionally controls it by funding, and whilst the Tories are blatantly abusing the post. The other valid point in all of this, going back to the reason for the investigation into Richard Sharp, that loan arrangement to Boris Johnson, is that with Johnson gone now from number 10, now Sharp gone from the BBC, the last figure involved there, we'll come back to him, I mentioned him right at the beginning, Simon Case, he continues to lurk about. He became the middleman for this arrangement and has much as I've stood up for and defended the civil service against attacks made against them, particularly in relation to the goings-on with Dominic Raab, figures like Case do them no favours. He's again been caught in a compromising position, and again, nothing gets done about him. He was Mr. Fixer here. Other than Sharp and Johnson, he was the only one in the know at the time that everything and all of this was going on. So why isn't he going too? Why isn't he resigning? Why isn't he going to be sacked? He had to hand over the Partygate investigation to Sue Gray because he was partying himself during that scandal, and he survived that too. Just how much can this guy survive and get away with? Enough's enough, surely. Thanks for watching. If you appreciated this video, please do hit like and subscribe. Leave a comment and hit the notification bell too so you don't miss the next one. Also, look out for me on social media and other interesting stuff by clicking on the Linktree link in the comments below. And I will see you next time. Cheers, folks.